So we are going to go ahead, just in the interest of time, because I think we'll have a lot to discuss here today. So I'm going to go ahead and get started. I'll thank everybody for joining us today. And I just want to remind everyone that the meeting is being recorded. So just be aware of that. We'll be recording the entire meeting. And then we'll publish it on our YouTube channel as well once we get it set up. So before we begin, I'm going to ask everybody to mute their microphones and just stay muted unless you're speaking because it eliminates some of that background noise. I apologize for not using video today. I live in a great big steel building and sometimes I have some broadband issues that kicks me out, and I thought I would limit that if possible today. And if you're having any issues, I would suggest that you close your video as well. That seems to help. Please use the chat for questions if we can for the time being, and then we'll open it up to more informal discussion towards the end. I'd like to acknowledge that we're on the traditional territory of the Fort Nelson First Nation. We are grateful to have Steve Baumber, Senior Timber Tenures Forester with the Forest Tenures branch of the Ministry of Forests, Lands, Natural Resource Operations, and Rural Development. And that is quite a mouthful, Steve. Steve's going to provide us with some information on Bill 22, the process as it applies to the sale of Canfor's forest license to Peak Renewables. And just before I turn it over to Steve, I'd like to make a few more introductions. So we have Brian Bardick today with Peak Renewables, as well as a few other Peak representatives. Brian will follow up with some comments on the purchase of the license and the pellet plant. And then we also have representatives from the community forest joining us today in case there's any questions on the community forest. And Lawrence Forsberg and Catherine Wolfenden and Jim Snetzinger are all with us. I'm not sure if there's anybody else, but I know of those ones. So I apologize if I missed anybody. And Steve, with that, I'm going to pass the virtual microphone over to you.
Okay, thank you very much, Bev. Can you hear me?
I can.
Excellent. Okay, so thank you for that good round of introductions to everyone that is going to be available today to answer questions and provide a little more information to everybody who's on the call today. So good morning. I'm coming from Victoria, and I just want to acknowledge that I work in the traditional areas of the Algonquin-speaking peoples, the Coast Salish and Esquimalt nations, and we're very honored to be able to sort of continue the long-standing tradition of humans interacting around resources and solving problems and meeting together to sort of in a good way begin discussions about what's best for community. So very happy to be part of this process. And again, thank you to Bev for having us sort of in a special session, I think, to answer some questions. So I won't speak to the broader project. I think there's been a presentation already from the group, and of course the representatives from both Peak Renewables and Canfor are with us, and the Fort Nelson First Nation. So I'm going to let them take care of that sort of information. What Bev's splashing up on her screen right now is a website that we have to help explain some of the process. So this particular page kind of lands you right in the middle of our information, but it gives you an idea of what we look for when we talk about the public interest. And so I'm going to backtrack a little bit and just give everybody a sense of what a tenure agreement transfer is all about. So across the province, forest companies hold tenure agreements. And these agreements are for areas of public forest that they now have the ability to go and harvest from. So a tenure agreement doesn't necessarily give an area. It can be just a volume, which in this case is what Canfor currently holds. It's a tenure agreement that has a certain amount of volume available to it. And so Canfor, as the current holder, could go out and harvest from the Fort Nelson timber supply area up to the limit of its volume holding under that agreement. And that agreement can be transferred to someone else. And so when that's the case, the current holder of the agreement, in this case Canfor, Canadian Forest Products, requests permission to do so. And the reason for that is because this tenure is on public land. It's what we would refer to in some cases Crown Forest. And so the Minister of Forests has the ability to ensure that the transfer is happening in a positive way that will benefit the community and be a good use of the license. One of the central things that the minister will consider is whether or not it changes the concentration of the holding of licenses. So up in the Northeast, it's not considered a concentrated market. And so when we get a request for a transfer of a license, generally we don't have a concern that the new holder is sort of cornering the market and all the available fiber that's there. But this is a substantial license that CAN4 holds. And so one of the first considerations that the minister will have before approving the request to transfer this license from CAN4 to Peak Fort Nelson Properties Limited is to consider whether or not that creates a concentration because this new person is now gaining this license from CAN4. Now, in this particular case, Peak Renewables and Peak Fort Nelson Properties Limited are new to the area in some respects, and they don't currently hold a lot of tenure or what we would consider tenure, so these agreements that allow them to go and harvest in the timber supply area. And so from that point of view, we don't foresee that there's going to be a difficulty for CAN4 being able to transfer to this new holder, Peak Fort Nelson Properties. So that's the first consideration that the minister will make. The second consideration is the one that we're sort of more here to talk about, which is the public interest. So when the public interest is raised to the minister's consideration, the minister will have lots of questions for us, and we try to anticipate what the minister might want to know about before making their decision in terms of whether or not the minister feels that the transfer is in the public interest. And this is all done under the Forest Act. So the Forest Act actually requires the minister to make these considerations before they approve the transfer of a license. So when the minister thinks about the public interest, the minister can turn her mind to all the sorts of things that you might be able to come up with on your own. So is it in the interest of the community? Is there an economic benefit to the new holder getting it? In the case of this particular license, what are the plans for beginning harvest again? What are the plans for extending the opportunity of harvesting under this license to other groups in the community? And we know for this project, there is quite a close partnership already established with the Fort Nelson First Nation. But there are other labor contracts and businesses and all kinds of people that could benefit from it. And so the minister will expect us to provide information to her that outlines the positives and also perhaps any negatives that might happen. So in some areas, there are concerns about somebody new coming into the area. Who is this, Fort Nelson Properties Limited? Who is Peak Renewables? What will they do to ensure that activities are, guided in a way that makes sense for the area and so, that's why discussions like this are important to allow people to get a sense of who's on the receiving end of this tenure transfer. And so when we present information to the minister for her to contemplate the public interest, one of her questions often is, okay, well, what kind of outreach has, the proponents engaged in? Is the community comfortable with who's receiving the license? Are they in a good position to be able to manage a timber tenure agreement? And so we try to create the information that helps us answer that. So all of this is in this website that Bev has up for us again to have a look at. And if you scroll down on the page for us, Bev, we get to a little block here that briefly describes in a very sort of technical sense the request for the transfer. So again, CAN4 would like to transfer the license to Peak Renewables. They have an agreement with that intended recipient, as we call them, but they have to ask the minister to approve the transfer first. And so when we want to, so that's sort of what's communicated there in that first block. And it also gives the context of the bigger project that's behind this timber tenure transfer. And I think I'll let Brian and his group speak to that better than I could. But included there is a submit a comment button. And so that is open to any citizen in BC. You click on that, you identify, it has the same information that was in the previous page. You identify where you're from, what your home community is, just so that we can ensure that we're getting comments from the local area and from within British Columbia. And then you have a text box with really no limits. So you can type in whatever thoughts you have about the tenure transfer, concerns you might have, or support that you are wanting to provide to communicate to the minister that you're encouraging the tenure transfer or that you have some concerns. There's also an opportunity to attach documents. And this is provided just because we know that sometimes there are, you know, that it's too much to try and get your thoughts down while you're staring at a web page. So you can create a Word document, you can create a PDF document, and those can be attached to whatever text you have in the message. And then this website just converts everything you've attached and created in your text box into an email, and it comes directly to me. And so when we receive it, we don't get any identifying information, and we then move forward with presenting or summarizing this information and presenting it to the minister. So the reason for making it anonymous is to ensure that people are comfortable in communicating information to the minister, and you know, feeling like their comments are not going to be shared openly, or at least with any sort of identifying information attached to it. And so hopefully we get, you know, some real honest expressions of either support or concern. And but if there are questions that people have, and if maybe you can switch back to the other website, Bev, the first one that you were showing, and if we scroll back up, there's also an email address, a little higher. There we go, contact information. So that general email address is somewhere where you can also pose questions. If you want to identify yourself, if you want a response, then that's perhaps a better way to submit a question to our branch. It will come to me again, and I'll be able to either respond on my own or bring it to the attention of the group to try and get a good response back. And so those are the two main considerations that happen with a timber tenure transfer: the marketing of fiber, as we call it, or this idea of, you know, whether or not the transfer is going to create a greater or lesser concentration in multiple hands that hold these tenure agreements in the area. And then also the public interest. How is the community going to benefit? You know, who is the intended recipient, and what's being done with that license, given that it's being transferred to somebody new. The last part that the minister will have to consider in whether or not to approve the request for the transfer of the license is consultation with First Nations. And that consultation is required under our Constitution of Canada, and it's a duty that the province engages in anytime there's a ministerial or statutory decision. And so that consultation has already been initiated with all of the licensees, all of the First Nations that are within the area that this license could operate. So essentially the Fort Nelson timber supply area. And so through that consultation, it's confidential with the province, but it's a government to government approach with all the First Nations that may be impacted by activities under this license. And so we will give that the time that it takes to ensure that it's a meaningful and sufficient consultation with all those nations. And then that piece of information is again brought to the minister's attention. So lots of information that we're gathering together, lots of considerations that are brought to the minister for her to make her decision. We anticipate that we can get all of this information together, hopefully by the end of February. And again, it's kind of a timeline that has a little bit of fluidity to it, because we know that this information doesn't necessarily come in all at once, and that there are often lots of discussions and meetings such as this one that we'll want to have and make sure that we make space for. So at the end of our process, we summarize all of this information. we get an opportunity to go in and get into the minister's schedule and then brief her on all of this information. She has an opportunity to ask questions. We try to anticipate many of those questions, which is why we go through this preliminary process of gathering all this information and summarizing it for her. And then her decision comes out. So the minister may approve the decision. She may refuse to approve the decision, so then the tenure transfer would not proceed, or she may approve the tenure transfer and attach conditions to that. The conditions are something that is relatively new in our Forest Act. It allows the minister to ensure that if she approves the transfer of a tenure holding, that any commitments that perhaps the intended recipient has made will be adhered to. So these sorts of conditions are not things that the minister can just invent. They're not things that we can introduce into a license that doesn't already exist in the license. So we couldn't suddenly make the license be something it's not. The intended recipient, Peak Fort Nelson Properties Limited, are expecting to receive a license of a certain type from CANFOR with a certain amount of volume attached to it. We can't interfere with that or change that license that they are receiving. But the minister can attach conditions that perhaps hold the intended recipient to commitments that they're making, acknowledgements that they've made about how they want to use the license, those sorts of things. So we'll be looking into that. But maybe turning back to the public interest, the public interest submissions that people can make either through letters to our minister using the web form that Bev has shown you that's accessible through this website, or directly using that email address to send notes to us. These are all things that can be introduced into the conversation as reasonable expectations for an intended recipient as the minister is contemplating whether or not to approve the transfer. So so there are ways that all of these things that may come into our conversation can be brought to the minister and can create some sort of influence on the decision and how it's communicated to the proponents. And by that I mean the transferor, which is CANFOR, and the transferee, which is Peak Renewables. So it does give space for those ideas to come into the minister's contemplation, and so that's where conditions can be attached. But again, I really want to stress that conditions are very much structured around particular things that are available to the minister, and not necessarily just anything that we want to attach or force or impose on an intended recipient. It's not a way of changing the way the license works, or how much volume is in the license, or being able to cut the license up into parts and share it to other people. Currently, we're only contemplating that this license moves as a whole from one holder to the next. So I'll sort of pause there and see if there's any initial questions. Perhaps some have come through on the chat, and I'll hand the mic back to Bev.
I think I'd be better at this by now. I don't see any questions in the chat. Does anybody want to unmute with a question for Steve? If not, I'll turn it over to Brian here. We'll just give it a second. Feel free. Hearing none.
I think there's a question from Abigail, Bev.
Oh, sorry, that just came in. Is there an expiry date for the current tenure under CANFOR?
Yes, there will be. Unfortunately, that's one piece of information I don't have at my fingertips. So I can certainly look it up and have it before the end of the meeting. But maybe I might reach out to perhaps Brian or Peter and see if they have that at their fingertips.
I don't have it at my fingertips. Peter, any comment?
I don't have it at my fingertips either, although
okay.
During the call, but maybe just a point of clarification. It is a replaceable license. So there is an expiry date in the current replaceable license, but there's also provisions that make it mandatory for government to offer a replacement. So the expiry date is not maybe as relevant as it might otherwise be.
Right. So I've got the information now, and for the question, the license again, it's a replaceable forest license. It has a 15-year term. So from the time that it's replaced, it gets extended for another 15 years. And as you've just described, when it's time for it to be replaced, there's actually a scheduled statutory time when these licenses have to issue a replacement or not. And that just gives the holder a bit of a planning window to make their plans if for some reason the license doesn't get replaced. And so so it kind of becomes sort of this leapfrogging idea that a license is replaced in sort of an ongoing basis, even though we call it a 15-year term. It's usually about every 5 or 10 years we enter into that replacement discussion, and then we add on, a brand new term of 15 years starting from sort of the 10-year spot. The current expiry of this particular license is January 31st, 2032. So that just gives you an idea. It was last replaced in 2017. And so we would likely be getting into conversations around its replacement somewhere around 2027, possibly sooner. And then if that replacement is approved, then we leapfrog ahead again and we reset the expiry date 15 years from the point of replacement. So hopefully that makes sense. But just to directly answer the question, this particular term of the license expires January 31st, 2032.
I see we have an additional question there. Is there a public review process for input between extensions?
That is another good question. Generally, there is not. The replacement process is a statutory requirement between the province and the license holder. And so at a certain date, the province has to enter into conversations with the license holder, offer the replacement, and then the license holder accepts the terms of the replacement, and on we go. What does have to happen is consultation with First Nations. And so, again, because a replacement is considered a statutory decision. So that level of consultation does go on, and notice is sent out to all of the nations. So there's no legal provision for public input at that point for the replacement of the license. I think in terms of maybe making that sound a little better, the public always has opportunities to comment to the ministry and to the minister with concerns about the holders of agreements in their area. It can be any licensee and any license. And so those types of conversations have to, be ongoing, basically, with the local district and region. So I would say that there's always an avenue for public comment and public interest in the management of these agreements.
Steve, I just had a question come in to me directly. Will contractors who worked for Canfor, who held evergreen contracts, be eligible to transfer those evergreen contracts to Peak Renewable? And I don't know if that's a question for you or a question for Brian, but.
I can take it, or Brian can. Perhaps I'll go from the point of view of the actual notice that we receive. Under the Forest Act, they actually have to identify all of those evergreen contracts. We call them Bill 13 contractors, or labor that have replaceable contracts. And so those replaceable contracts have to be noted, and is a legal requirement that those contracts move with the agreement to the new intended recipient, to the new holder. And so in their notice that they sent, or they being Canfor and Peak Fort Nelson Properties, they have identified the sort of renewable or evergreen contracts that they have in place under that agreement. And so we have a list of contractors that that we've been notified will be moving with the agreement. So I don't know if perhaps one of the proponents might want to take that a little further than I've taken it.
Right. Certainly. Thank you, Steve. Good question. So the answer to the question is we are reaching out to some of the Evergreen or Bill 13 contractors, and are determining what their interest is at this stage. So clearly a priority for us is to rebuild contractor capacity, and it starts with that existing contractor interest that existed when the operations were shut down a number of years ago.
Okay, and I see we have another question. If at some point between now and 2032, if Peak for whatever reason shuts down the pellet plant, what happens to the tenure?
Yeah, so in terms of the tenure, it'd be a similar type of situation that you see existing today with Canfor, where it could be held for a period of time until another interest comes along that has a use for that tenure. Obviously, that's not our interest. When you think about a pellet plant, the proposal is really for offtake agreements that extend for in excess of 20-year time frames. So not the cyclical nature of what used to exist here, which was the OSB facility and a plywood plant, if I remember correctly. So those were subject to a much more cyclical economic environment than we expect to face with a pellet plant, where we expect to have a 15 to 20-year offtake agreement that allows us to provide that certainty to the community and to the operation.
Okay, maybe if I can just expand on that. Is that the type of condition that the minister could put on the transfer of the forest license, is the requirement to manufacture locally? And that
go ahead, please.
No, I was just going to add in that if Peak at some point decided that they weren't able to operate the pellet plant, that requirement we would not sit in limbo.
Right. So that sort of requirement, unfortunately, I don't think exists for any of our licenses, except perhaps a couple of licenses that were issued during the mountain pine beetle era. One of the major moves that the government made, or the province made a number of years ago, was to remove something that they called appurtenancy. So appurtenancy is just a legal word that means that you create a contract that has a very fixed piece to it that's tied to it. It makes it reliant on another piece. And in this case, for our forest agreements or forest tenure agreements, it used to be that you had to have some sort of milling capacity to be able to hold a license. And that if you didn't have milling capacity, or if you closed your mill, then you would lose your license. And as mills started to consolidate in the province, this was seen as sort of a barrier to being able to move these licenses to different holders. And certainly as First Nations started to create their own companies and wanting to hold tenure in the province, but not obviously own a manufacturing facility, it started preventing those types of businesses and business interests being able to hold these tenure agreement licenses. So the government made the decision to remove that requirement, and it hasn't really been meaningfully reintroduced to any of our tenure agreements. So I know it's not quite the same as perhaps a local manufacturing requirement, but it kind of amounts to the same type of wording. And so I also would go back to the idea that this particular license has been around for a while. Canfor has held it for many years. And when they transfer that license to somebody new, and in this case, Peak Fort Nelson Properties, we can't change the license. We can't create new requirements on it or stipulate things that don't currently exist in the license and wouldn't be permitted for us to attach to that license under the Forest Act. But I also would point to the fact that we do look to how the license is intended to be used, what the intentions are by the intended recipient, and the minister does have an opportunity to identify those sorts of community commitments that perhaps an intended recipient will be making. And it sort of adds emphasis and sort of a public awareness to the fact that this license is being transferred with particular intentions for providing local employment.
Okay, we've got a couple more questions coming in now. If I'm understanding correctly, if for whatever reason the pellet plant shuts down, logs could still be sold to interests outside of the community.
That's correct. So currently the tenure agreement is considered a separate arrangement, and to hold that license means that you have the ability to go out and create cutting permits and harvest wood. And what you do with that wood is then up to the business that holds the agreement. So if they're providing it to a particular local facility, that's what they'll do with it. In this case, we know that that only a portion of the wood profile might be appropriate under this license to go to that facility. So there's going to be a mix of where the logs from this tenure and other tenures go. So, and that's what we consider the provincial log market. So in some cases, it's good that logs travel out of the community.
So Brian, the next question is for you. Do you want to make your comments before answering it? I can go ahead and read it out. So if anybody's on the phone and not able to see the screen, the question is, Mr. Barta, why have you seen it necessary to purchase the license if there is more than enough AAC, annual allowable cut, outside of the Canfor tenure to supply the pellet plant?
So Bev, I think you opened the door to me to make some of the broader comments
Absolutely.
tonight, and so I'll do that, and it may address this question as part of that. And also I note that James Tate is on the line as well, and I'm going to invite him to say a few words as well, given his representation of the Fort Nelson First Nation. So I'd just like to remind, there's lots of really good questions here. And what I'd like to remind the people on this call is that we are interested in developing this plant in conjunction with the community of Fort Nelson, and also in conjunction with the Fort Nelson First Nation. So, so just to really reiterate that point, we see this as a significant development for the community, a significant development to create jobs and employment opportunities within the community as well. And Peak Renewables was founded by, I think, as I've mentioned previously in previous presentations, by Brian Fair. And one of the things that Brian believes, along with myself and the rest of our team, we believe in developing local communities and developing them in conjunction with the people in the community, but also with the First Nations that are in that particular area. So this particular project is our first significant project. We've got a couple of other smaller ones, but the first significant project, 600,000 ton pellet plant, which will need probably in the range of somewhere between 1.3 and 1.4 million cubic meters of fiber. We're not only requesting the Canfor tenure of 553, we're also going to be asking for additional tenures through the Ministry of Forest. And when I say that, it will ultimately, I believe, be through the Fort Nelson First Nation, and James Tate can talk about that as well. And so the combination is required because the pellet plant is going to be looking for the deciduous component of the fiber, and the coniferous portion of the fiber we believe will be marketed both within the community and external to the community, again, to help support building this project. So that's back to the question. That's the reason why we require more fiber than just simply the 553 plus the additional requirements that we will be asking the government for. So again, we believe that we'll be employing roughly 55 to 60 people directly at the mill, and then another 250 plus people in the harvesting operations. And back to one of the questions is who are we going to look for and who's going to support that. We are going to be looking at people that have the capability to get operational sooner rather than later. Look for that existing contractor capability, and the Bill 13 contractors are being contacted as we speak. Some of you will note that there's been some small activities, logging activities occurring as we speak. And one of the things that we're trying to do is just develop the capability to get harvesting going. Our challenge as we take a look at getting a pellet plant up and running is going from 0 to 100% all at once is a significant challenge. And so we're looking to see what capability is there today. And there's people today harvesting primarily some coniferous, but they're also harvesting some deciduous that, assuming the plant gets up and running, will be utilizing that fiber. So we're looking forward and trying to create opportunity today and also tomorrow as we, and I say that figuratively, as we get the plant up and running. So we believe this is a good project for the community, long-term economic development, long-term, as I said, offtake agreements with customers for the pellets. We're working hard on both CN and the provincial government to really redevelop the railway capacity again for not only the industrial activity here, but also for whatever other industrial activity could occur. James, I'm going to turn it over to you. I think maybe one other point is everything we're doing is in conjunction with the land use management plan that the Fort Nelson First Nation has been working on and developing, and we're proud to be a partner with the Fort Nelson First Nation on developing this project. Over to you, James.
Great. Yeah. Brian, thanks very much. And good morning to everyone on the Zoom this morning. For those who don't know me, I've met many of you. Hello to everyone that I've met before. For those who don't know me, I'm James Tate. I'm a lawyer, and I've been working with the Fort Nelson First Nation on forestry initiatives over the last several years, including working with the NRRM and the ministry on putting together the community forest, which has been a really rewarding and significant collaboration between FNFN and the town of Fort Nelson. That's been, very fruitful, and it has resulted in the achievement of what is actually the largest community forest agreement and largest community forest in all of British Columbia. And that's, one of the foundational pieces to developing the forestry economic opportunity in Fort Nelson. And FNFN has definitely a synergistic interest with Fort Nelson in making that investment opportunity happen and the forestry opportunity. And the Peak Group has brought a project to the table which really fits well with FNFN's balanced objectives of both providing economic opportunities for its members and the community, as well as operating a forestry practice in a very sustainable way that's respectful of land traditional values, treaty rights, and as Brian mentioned, there is a commitment to doing long-term harvesting plans that fit with the environmental values and traditional land and water values that are important to FNFN. And so there's a real commitment to striking that balance and collaborative planning in that regard as well. I think that obviously the key, one of the key pieces of the project will include this tenure Obviously, the CFA, I know, and not speaking for the CFA because we have representatives of the CFA on the Zoom today, but I know that the CFA are also developing plans to integrate and work with the Peak project in terms of fiber supply. FNFN as an entity plans to have its own standalone tenures, and also integrate those tenures into the project as well. I noticed in the chat, I think Abigail had asked about that the tenure is more to the benefit of FNFN than Peak. Really, what is contemplated is a partnership between Peak and FNFN in the project, and the CAN4 tenure, as well as other tenures that Brian mentioned, are really seen as partnership assets. And so that's, I think, the best way to look at those particular tenures. It's not really one entity or the other that's benefiting. It is a partnership, and that's another attractive part of this project for FNFN. It allows the nation to hold a stake and have a really vested interest in the outcome of the project as well. There's also the prospects of FNFN developing its own harvesting capacity, providing all kinds of different opportunities for its members, both in long-term employment positions, in education and scholarships, and the training component that goes with the project as well. And these are all really significant opportunities. It's the kind of thing that we have been working for several years, and we think it fits really well with the objectives of Fort Nelson generally as well. Brian, I'll just turn it back to you.
Thank you very much, James, and I appreciate you filling in any blanks that I missed. I would also point out that the initial harvesting activities that we're undertaking today are supported by also by the provincial government in the form of training grants. Again, all with the intent of trying to build capacity in the community. I'll turn it back to you, Bev, and open it up to further questions.
I don't know if we lost her or not, Brian.
I'm trying to figure out if Bev's got her. I can't tell whether her mic's on or off.
I could make a general comment here for everybody on the line here if they wish.
Of course, Lawrence.
So my name is Lawrence Forsberg. I'm the chair and the director of the CFA for our community forest. I think this is more about a Fort Nelson initiative. That really, if you think about it, this is a key component of rejuvenating the forest here in the region. One of the challenges for the CFA is going to have is the deciduous portion off our tenure. So we need an outlet for the deciduous portion for us to be able to do something with the conifer. So I think it's encouraging that it looks like potentially we have an outlet for that, and that piece would work very well for the community forest. This is one of the things that, for over 12 years we've been sitting idle here. I think this is a welcome thing that could come. This is more than just about a tenure transfer. This is about, I think, if you look at it, I view this as the potentially the survivor of, I guess, the crisis to the Fort Nelson issue in the economy here. So, I mean, without continuing with laboring on here, I think this is probably quite a good project for the Fort Nelson region. So I think in general, the CFA welcomes something like this.
I think maybe if I'm probably going to hear my dog barking in the background, my apologies. One of the things that we're noting already for reference is we start with a pellet plant. We have longer term views. Phase 1 is pellet plant. Phase 2 is potentially other developmental opportunities within the community. We clearly want to support local sawmilling capacity that currently exists within the community today. But what I'd also say is if you build it, it will come. And we've had reach in from several interested parties on some of the higher end aspen. For one of them is a veneer type of opportunity. Again, whether it's real or not, we don't know, but it'll be interesting to see whether it comes to fruition. And then also using again high quality aspen for furniture. So again, we're optimistic that we start something and it creates some momentum for further developmental activities in the community.
Well, thank you for that words, Brian. I do want to talk about one little piece, and I think it goes on the shirt tails of what you've been talking about, and that is the synergies that quite likely Peak Renewables will bring to the community. We have, there's local proponents here. There's local demand. I think when I speak about this, not just being about Peak Renewables, this is about the whole community. And I think really all pieces have to fit in order for this to work.
Can you hear me now?
We can.
Bev,
Oh,
thank you.
Excellent. I don't know what's going on this morning. Thanks very much for that. And Lawrence, thanks for jumping in. I see we do have another question. It seems the First Nation and the corporation are well represented in this venture. I am seeing as absent the representation of the Northern Rockies Regional Municipality. How do the people of Fort Nelson become better represented? And I'm not sure that anybody besides Mayor Foster can maybe address this. And I do think he's on the call if he wants to jump in.
You bet. Thanks, Bev. So the Northern Rockies Regional Municipality is, of course, going to be making representation to the Ministry of Forest about the forest tenure transfer. But as Mr. Barda and Mr. Forsberg have said, this is a tremendous opportunity for the Northern Rockies and for the people here. We've had no forest industry here for the past decade, and we look forward to this project by Peak Renewables. And this is, as Mr. Barda said, this is the first of several phases going forward. As anybody in Fort Nelson knows, of course, we're not in favor of seeing conifer leave our community, but this is an essential part of Peak Renewables' business model to get their plant off the ground, and this is what we're going to support here going forward.
Thanks, Mayor Foster. So when I was talking before when nobody could hear me, I did say that I thought people could jump off of mute if they wanted to ask questions directly, or of course continue to use the chat. I know that we do have some people with hard deadlines at noon, so we are going to end on time. So we have about 10 more minutes. If anybody has any other questions they'd like to add. Must be something.
Well, and Bev, the only other, I always like making another comment, and I'm sure James and our team are here. We're always happy to answer any questions and be available to answer questions. And I certainly appreciate you supporting this awesome methodology called Zoom and providing this forum. It's I believe in COVID times, and with the thought around safety of all the individuals on this call, this is a fabulous forum, aside from being able to do all this in person, which we'd really appreciate being able to do, but do recognize the times we're in. So thank you very much, Bev.
Oh, absolutely. I think the more information we can get out, the better. People need to be well informed. And I just note I just got a thing asking me how to put your hand up. Abigail, if you have a comment to make, just go ahead and unmute, or I can attempt to unmute you, and then you can speak. You don't need to put your hand up.
Can you hear me?
Yeah,
Can you hear me?
we can hear you.
Because it's way too long to type. So in the previous Zoom meeting that we had before Christmas, Mr. Barta mentioned that there was a relationship between Canfor and the Tenure and the Peak plant. And I'm trying to connect dots that, and I think there was an intimation in that Zoom meeting that there is a financial relationship between the Canfor's need to get the logs out of that old coniferous leading Canfor license, not old, but the Canfor license where the coniferous is leading. And there's a relationship between Peak being able to, I don't know, work out some of the financial details between them getting the old Tacoma mill site, et cetera, and the access to the railhead, et cetera, that provides. So there is a question at the end of this. The question is, if you are in a relationship with Canfor for doing some sort of a log for capital infrastructure costs, is there a timeline on that? So is there a timeline set between Canfor and Peak where Canfor is no longer going to hold the purse strings on you?
Well, Abigail, well, first of all, thank you for diving into a level of detail and much appreciated. Some of it I'm not really in a position to fully answer, and I'll just be very frank about that. That's commercial agreements that are between us, the Fort Nelson First Nation, and Canfor. But what I will say is Canfor has sold us the property, and they sold us the property for $10 million. And they have been gracious enough to take a down payment. And as we work our way through more details, we will be finishing off that over a couple of years of time. And there's no linkage in purchasing the asset. There's no linkage to fiber in that particular side of it. One of the things we did ask Canfor when we bought the mill site is, can we buy your tenure at the same time? And as you know, there's a headline amount of us buying the tenure off of Canfor. And again, we're a startup company. We don't have the cash to pay the kind of money Canfor wants all at once. And so we do have a commercial arrangement that allows us to ship a portion of the coniferous logs to them over a period of time, in addition to making direct payments out of the earnings of the pellet plant, again, to pay for that tenure acquisition. So that's where it's at. We expect to market the fiber to a much broader range of potential interests than just Canfor. Abigail, thank you.
Fair enough. Just to try and hold your feet a little bit more to the fire, can you give us that timeline? Will it be the 10 years that you're going to the payback for the property value, et cetera? I mean, yeah.
It is not a 10-year agreement.
There is an expiry on that agreement, though, correct?
In both cases, there's a timeline to, as we develop the pellet plant, to repay Canfor. Abigail, thank you.
Okay, so I'm going to jump back in because I see we only have like 5 minutes left. So maybe have time for one really quick question before I close, if there's anybody wants to jump in.
I'll just make a comment that when we spoke with Mr. Fair, they mentioned that, any proponent who came along and was looking to utilize conifer in the community, Peak Renewables would look very favorably on that and be inclined to sell conifer to anyone who was manufacturing locally.
And I think, Mayor Foster, thank you very much. I think clearly, to the extent that there's manufacturing capability of the coniferous and for the deciduous in Fort Nelson, it's quite a freight bill to put that log anywhere else, whether it's on rail, whether it's on a truck. That is not a low-cost log for anyone. And so it clearly makes, some economic sense to develop capability in Fort Nelson to avoid that expensive freight premium.
Thank you. Okay, so I'm going to start wrapping it up because I know people have other things on their agendas today. I first want to thank all of our representatives, Steve from the ministry, Brian and Jim and James and Lawrence and everybody that spoke. I can't go through the whole list. And we will put out, I did put at the beginning of this meeting the link to the Tenure branch site for anybody that does want to add comments. And I will also I don't know if everybody's aware, we do have a forestry survey currently out within the community. That's going to remain active until the end of January. We wanted to have an opportunity for this meeting prior to thinking about closing that. So if you haven't provided feedback, we would really appreciate it if you could, and that will get sent out again. And it's important because it helps inform the Chamber Board and what our members are thinking and what's important to them. And then just our next meeting is going to be February 18th. And we have Scott Wisdell and Tracy Leishman from MNP LLP. And they're going to talk about some of the changes to the different government programs around the COVID benefit programs, as well as T4 and tax requirements. So also an important meeting for business. Again, thank you so much, Brian. Thank you, Steve. Really appreciate your jumping on, and we will do this again.
My pleasure. And as Brian had said, anyone who has comments or questions can continue this conversation with us offline through email or phone calls.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, and Brian, maybe I'll just add that I know I saw Nancy on the call. Hi, Nancy. From Peak Renewables, and there is a website as well as an email, and I would encourage anyone that's interested in having that conversation to get a hold of proponents directly. Okay, everybody, have a wonderful afternoon. Happy Thursday.